bureaucrats should probably be in charge of these things. Like when it comes to like the EPA or the Department of Education, even the Department of Defense, the idea that Republicans come in and they change something, Democrats come in and they change it back. It's probably not the best thing, especially since they don't know the intricacies of that specific department. Just imagine you have people who have been in a job for 25, 30, 40 years. Like you as a president, you can't possibly know as much as them in that particular department.
Right.
Yet you come in and you make this giant policy change that radically affects how the department runs. And you do that across the board for every single department. And then you appoint brand new people to head the department. It's like, it's crazy. It's almost like we should detach the president from the actual bureaucracy itself. They're supposed to be apolitical. They're not supposed to be a Democrat in office. They're not supposed to institute policies that are conservative based. They're supposed to do what's best for the country as a whole. I
would imagine what makes sense for the department itself, not for any political purpose.
Yeah. But then again, now that you say that might be the reason that they do it, because a lot of bureaucrats may be pushing for their department versus what's best for the country. So you'd have the FBI director pushing to get more of that sweet, sweet DOD money.
Welcome to PolyPsych.org.
Almost there, just one more time.
Welcome to PolyPsych.org.
So we did the interview with Professor Brady Jones at the University of St. Francis. She has research on enlightened self-interest.
Yes. Let's
It's
find
kind of
out.
awesome. Yeah. All right, so check it out.
So on standards, there were no differences between the long-term urban and suburban teachers. They both held themselves to equally high standards. On discrepancy, the gap between standards and what you think you can realistically achieve, no differences there either. Where we saw the differences was in order. So what that means is the teachers in urban schools, these are long-term teachers in urban schools, they cared less when things weren't totally neat, tidy, organized. They were more able to roll with the punches when things didn't go how they planned. And so I see this, I'm not saying, one kind of perfectionism profile is better than the other, but I think it makes a lot of sense that people who are able to commit long-term to teaching in urban schools are really good at letting these moments where things don't go how they plan kind of roll off their back. I see it as a real strength that they either kind of just have or that they've developed over time working in schools with fewer resources and with kids who are potentially coming to them with more challenges.
So one of my concerns with my kids is that some teachers have seemed burnt out. The only ones that I've seen still passionate about their jobs are the brand new teachers. So is it possible that new teachers start out with higher levels of enlightened self-interest? And can you detail how enlightened self-interest may wane with time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So what you're talking about is a separate article, but the same sample of teachers. And so the perfectionism paper that I just talked about was one tiny piece of personality. The enlightened self-interest paper you're talking about now is I gave these 118 teachers who are spread across urban and suburban schools a whole bunch of personality measures. And I looked to see what was most important in distinguishing long-term commitment to the occupation versus people who left really fast from teaching or who plan to leave pretty soon. And what I found, what you're alluding to, is this really interesting idea that other smart narrative psychologists have named that I was just using. It's called enlightened self-interest. And it's the idea that people who just kind of do well in life, they feel fulfilled and happy, they do work that is important to society, tend to combine these two fundamental human motivations. So agency is wanting to self-promote, to be noticed, to really do a good job, to gain kind of power and prestige for yourself. And communion is the urge to connect with other people, maybe even sacrifice yourself for those people or to care for other people in some way. And people who do really well in lots of different areas tend to combine these two motivations. And so what you're talking about in this study is, I think, kind of surprising. I think there are all these cultural stories in the United States about teachers aren't very ambitious. They go into the job because it's good security, because they want to be on that set pay scale. They don't have to work for promotions, whatever. People have all kinds of stories they tell. And in this sample, I'm finding that the teachers who were really committed and who stayed for a long time, they did have those communal motivations. They wanted to really care for their students. They were in teaching for some of the reasons we think teachers traditionally are, but they were super ambitious within those contexts. So they would set these really tough goals for themselves and achieve them. Or they would, when you ask them about the best moments in their lives as teachers, they would talk about when my debate team won the state championship. So they were really ambitious, but in this kind of like caring communal context. So either they were really ambitious on behalf of their students, or they were really ambitious in working with and connecting with colleagues within schools. So you were asking about, does this enlightened self-interest, might it kind of wane over time? And I don't know for sure, but I will say that the longer teachers were committed, the higher they were in this enlightened self-interest. It was the most important thing that predicted long-term commitment to teaching. And that it seems to me, I think what the next interesting question that we could look at is, are they staying longer in teaching because they're setting these kind of goals for themselves that they're really excited about, but they're also goals that connect them to the people around them. So that I think that might be a really sustaining way to live your career. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's a really good way to like stay satisfied. You keep setting goals for yourself, but you're not like doing it disconnected from other people. You're doing it for and with other people. I just think that's a really great way to live. And I think this study provides evidence for that, and lots of other previous studies have too.
That's a really good point about it. Like different professions require a little bit of a different like perspective on how you see your particular position. But as a teacher, maybe there's not so many ways to like promote as in like a ladder situation, but you can promote yourself within your position.
Yes, that's an excellent point. So teaching, a lot of people have theorized about this. Teaching in general is a profession where there aren't a lot of built-in ways that you get rewarded. So there aren't really promotions unless you want to become an administrator.
Yeah.
You don't normally get raises. Some schools recently have tried to do like merit-based raises and stuff, but it really is a profession that's, I think, really primed for people to do well with this enlightened self-interest way of living, because they're setting their own goals. You know, and they're finding ways to feel really accomplished within an occupation that doesn't make it particularly easy to feel accomplished, I think.
So it sounds like enlightened self-interest, with the second part of it being having a community around you that you're attached to. It sounds a lot like what is it, social capital. So I'm doing actually right now, I'm doing a research report with Professor Whitaker at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, on immigration opinion. And one of the biggest determinants that we're finding is that the number of people in your social network can drastically affect your immigration opinion. And it seems like at least a part of that is also affecting like teachers' commitment to the profession itself. Almost like they're creating like their own in-group, their own community inside of the school. And that may affect their commitment to the job as a whole.
I can see that.
Yeah, I love that idea. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. Like, I think we tend to think of these agentic and communal motivations as separate, but the more I think about it and the more work I do in here, the more like our success as individuals and living good lives is intimately tied to the people around us, how they can help us and how we can help them. I mean, have you heard that quote, people are people through other people? Like that doesn't surprise me at all that people tend to have better immigration outcomes if they've got a big social network, because you've just got more people to rely on to help you. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that there are connections. I think we can see the benefits of intertwining those two motivations throughout basically every aspect of human life, not to overstate it, but I do think that this is a really, really healthy way to live your life.
Definitely, I agree. Have you been able to find a particular personality type that fits with the type who are, going back to your first article, that is, who are able to overlook or work past that inherent chaos in some of the lower funded schools? I know me personally, like, I get nervous just thinking about like not having enough books for my 23 in my class. I would just lose my mind.
No, so first of all, one thing I should have said way back at the beginning is I think when people say personality, a lot of people think about things like the Myers-Briggs personality test where you're like an INFJ or whatever. The way that I think about personality is really holistic. So if I can just back up and say that. So it takes into consideration personality traits that maybe they're more kind of genetically based or that you're born with. Like, do you tend toward being extroverted or introverted, or do you tend to be high in conscientiousness or low? So it takes those into consideration, but it also takes into consideration ways of living your life that you have a lot more control over and that change a lot over time. So things like, what goals do you pursue? What values have you developed over time? How do you think about your life as kind of an overall story and the moments in your life? How do you think and talk about those in a way that builds your identity in a certain way? So I don't have like an exact, I can't point to a certain personality type that's more likely to stick it out in those kinds of situations, although that's a really interesting question. But I think we can look at things like, can you let difficulties kind of roll off your back? Are you resourceful? You know, are there ways to that you can kind of use maybe the limited resources you have and make the best use of them and not get too stressed out like that? There's just really, if you're interested in this, in like how teachers sustain themselves in tough kind of poverty-stricken situations, Martin Haberman has this classic book. I think he wrote it several decades ago. It's called Star Teachers of Children in Poverty, and he lists very specific ways that teachers in really tough circumstances, that the practices they do daily that make them successful and help sustain them in the occupation over time. But the best that the two things we've talked about with my research is the best I have to comment on that. So valuing order, the order dimension of perfectionism less, and then this kind of enlightened self-interest way of thinking about challenges. So can you set ambitious goals for yourself, and can you pursue those goals kind of in communion with other people?
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So it's more of like a like you're looking for a fluidity of personality. There's not really a set.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So awesome.
That's a good way to put it.
Thank you. So is your research to say that teachers with the short-term, more of a short-term commitment are of a less quality to the students' education? And what is the advantage to having a staff of all long-termers?
That's an excellent question. So first of all, I should say both of the papers we've talked about don't take into consideration how effective the teachers are. We don't have any measure of teacher effectiveness, which is, by the way, a really hard thing to measure. You can look at student standardized test scores, but then it opens a whole can of worms about, are they working with students who are already going to score high on standardized tests, blah, 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 blah. So we don't have any measure of whether these teachers are effective. So to some extent, I can't speak to that, but it does bring up some interesting issues. So another thing I should have said way back is the sample of teachers we're talking about, it's about 125 people who are calling academically elite teachers. So all of these individuals got admission into this really tough teacher preparation program, and they had to get very high scores on their GRE, which I'm sure you two know is like the SAT to get into graduate school, basically. So they had really, really high GRE scores. So they're an interesting sample because there's a lot of interest, I think, right now, not only in recruiting more teachers into the occupation, but recruiting like some of the smartest people in our country to become teachers. Because, the people in this sample really could have chosen, they could have had their pick of professions. They could have gone to med school or law school. They could go into business and hopefully make a bunch of money. And they chose to teach. So being smart doesn't necessarily make you an amazing teacher, but there's some overlap there. Like teachers who are particularly kind of verbally able tend to do better. Their students tend to do better. So that's, I guess, the best I can say about the teacher's effectiveness. But then you ask a really interesting question, which is, what is the value of long-term teaching? Is it okay if teachers teach for 5 years and then leave? And I can only speculate about this. I think it's probably okay to have a little bit of teacher turnover. You get some fresh blood, you get new ideas, you let people self-select out of the occupation if it's not working for them. I would never want to pass a law that says, if you keep teaching, you have to stay in it for 30 years for the good of the students. Like, that seems like a bad idea for everybody.
I don't see the good of the students at all.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, just I don't see that being good for the students at all around year 6.
Definitely not. But I think that there are, I think most people agree that teacher turnover is higher than most other occupations, and that kids do benefit from kind of a stable teaching force in their schools. And in addition, there are kind of racial and class inequalities with teacher turnover. So the poorest kids and Black kids, minority kids generally, are more likely to be in schools where there's lots of teacher turnover. So you're getting new teachers in every few years, and it can just be hard to develop any sort of school culture or continuity with that. So I guess in my mind, when I envision kind of an ideal teacher workforce or a school with kind of an ideal makeup of teachers. I think that there is some churn. Some people come and leave pretty quickly, but I think you've got a good solid base of people who've been at that school for a long time, or at least in the occupation for a long time, who can kind of be, you know, the leaders and kind of like the rocks and the mentors to the new teachers. So I think we wouldn't want every teacher to stay in forever, but I think it would be good if we got more teachers to stay for longer.
All right. So, last question, and then I'll let you go.
No, this has been great, you guys. I love this. Thanks for asking me all these questions.
No, it's no problem. All right, last question. I'm putting you in charge of the Department of Education. All right, Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos is gone. All right, so you're in charge of the Department of Education starting tomorrow. So what policies do you institute? What do you do? How do you change the system? Go for it.
So I'm gonna punt on this question just a little bit, because I think the best thing we can do. Well, I do have a strategy, but I don't have a lot of specific policies. So
that's fine.
I think what you need to do. I think education is very susceptible to lots of policy swings. So one party gets in power, you take that policy this way. The other party gets into power, you take it this way. We get excited about some trend in education, and all of a sudden we all realign the schools to do that. I think what we should do is take a step back, think about where we want our education system to go very broadly over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and make a strategic plan that we're going to stick with over time. I think the U.S., it's kind of part of our American culture to get very excited about things and kind of chase these, sometimes even fads. And I think, like I said, education is particularly susceptible to that. So I think if we could be a little bit slower, a little bit more thoughtful, that would be good. I guess one specific policy I would say is, it sure seems like most people can agree that if we can incentivize, not necessarily through money, maybe partly through money, partly through something else, teachers who go to work at the schools that have really high turnover, that seem like they're really hard places to work, if you can make that, maybe you give them like a reduced teaching load so they can give students a lot of personal attention. Maybe you do pay them more. Maybe you reward them with things like sabbaticals, like college professors get. I mean, if you can make those places really appealing places to work, then I think you're going to, pretty soon, those schools that are hard places to teach are going to be seen as the best places to teach, and the students are going to benefit from it. So definitely. I would try to set in place a series of incentives like that, too.
Thanks for listening to PolyPsych. Subscribe on iTunes. Go to PolyPsych.org, create a profile so that we can interview you one-on-one. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.